All right, so we're going
Yeah,
to move to number four, and Joel, tell us a little bit about smart energy.
absolutely. I think thermostats is obviously the first thing people think of when they're thinking about energy in an apartment. There is more to it than that, and certainly EV infrastructure is a big area that's sort of changing the dynamic of what the expectations are for a lot of properties. I think building on what you said, you want to shift the responsibility for these energy-related costs as much as you can to the tenant, and you want to de-risk as an owner, an operator, your share of that as much as you can. So depending on the property, there's lots of properties where units are billed individually by the utility. That's great. They have a skin in the game at that point as far as how efficient or inefficient they are. But there are quite a few that don't. And retrofitting those properties to shift that risk is often very challenging. So, one of the use cases we see quite a bit of interest in ours and a lot of activity around is sub-metering existing buildings and being able to get each unit, sort of allocated their actual energy expense and shifting that away, incentivizing them to improve their efficiency. And for, a lot of funds that have large portfolios, they're being asked to show ESG benchmarking and progress towards sustainability goals. It's a lot easier to do that when there's skin in the game by the tenant. So shifting that responsibility from an OPEX perspective to the tenant, I think, is one area that we're seeing a lot of interest in. EVs is another huge area. It's whose responsibility is it? How is the cost for that identified and allocated? If it's just part of one giant bill, you're sort of putting your finger in your mouth and, how about $100 a month and we'll call it even, We have no idea if that's actually accurate. Utility rates vary, all that sort of stuff. Connecticut and a lot of other parts of the country, my utility rate doubled from December to January. You're not going to rewrite your lease from December to January, so now you're on the hook for that. It's a lot different if you actually can isolate that from the rest of the activity in the facility. And if it's allocated to a specific tenant, now you can say, okay, here's what the space costs, the parking space costs, and then here's what the actual usage on the charger was. And we can very effectively turn a $400 level 2 charger from a revenue grade perspective, to what a $10,000 charger would be.
So I know you explained the technology in our Monday afternoon session, but just in case there's anyone here in the room who didn't, take another minute or two and just kind of re-explain what these do, how they're deployed.
So this is a sub-metering solution. We have the IP around it. It uses an IoT protocol called LoRaWAN to communicate. What that means in real simple terms is you set up a centralized gateway and all my devices connect to that from behind the panel. The things that make my product unique, this is called the hot drop. You can install it in a live environment so you don't have interruption to the operation of the facility. It's not hardwired in any way. There's no batteries in it as well. It inductively charges, similar to how your phone can charge on the little charge pad. We inductively charge off the flux on the wire. So really this is QR code scan, wrap around the wire inside the panel, snap closed, close the panel, you're on to the next. So from a retrofit perspective, there's nothing else like it in the market. It's 99.83% accurate, so well beyond the 98% revenue grade requirement from an accuracy perspective. So really is pretty disruptive when you're trying to retrofit and introduce energy monitoring in environments that typically would have considerations, whether it's scheduling and availability, cost. We see cost of ownership reductions of about 90% relative to other sub-metering technologies because it's so much easier to scope and deploy, and that installation labor cost goes down significantly. We have large-scale projects where we do 200, 300 of these in a day with just an electrician. So, and it's safe to install, like I said, in live environments. So in a lot of cases, you have your local maintenance person who's able to do this without necessarily having to bring in someone outside to do it.
It certainly feels like as we look into the next 3 to 5 to 10 to 20 years that this space, particularly in certain geographies in the United States, is going to be pretty key. When you're starting to look at more peak, utility charge times, that
Yep.
what time of the day you're using electricity. You want to be able to bill the customer for differently, because that's what you're getting billed differently for. Throw in solar panels, batteries, microgrids,
The grid
EV
is
vehicles.
the grid's becoming much more complex, and it's becoming much more dependent on the facilities that use the energy being interactive with the grid. So the thermostats obviously play a big role in that, but being able to manage your loads and understand when and how energy is being used throughout the facilities, that's enormously important to the utilities. And rate structures, as you were just describing, are going to be changing more and more to address the needs of the utility with this, all the complexities of renewables, chargers, all that sort of stuff. So preparing for that and having that infrastructure in place, that you really understand how usage in your buildings are managed, and what's driving the usage is going to be key.
Yeah, and it feels like each of these communities is going to be like its own city, or county or state, in the sense that they're really trying to figure out how to manage their energy. I grew up in Southern California, and I don't remember how old I was when I actually realized that a lot of the reservoirs there are basically giant batteries that they're using, that during the day they will use electricity to pump water from a lower reservoir up to a higher reservoir, so that then at night, when they don't or when they need that additional electricity, they can let the water drain and run turbines to power at whatever peak times they have. And I kind of feel like we're not going to be too far away where you're going to be trying to manage this electricity. Well, I've got solar panels. I want to put them into my big on-site batteries so that I can use them at night to charge the cars that are charging at night, because that's when they're parked.
Yeah.
It's going to be a lot more of trying to figure out where and when and how we're managing that.
You're going to want to have more and more, as you have the opportunity. I think built facilities are going to try to have some independence and autonomy from the grid. Costs could be very different at different times of the day, depending on the utility. They're trying to pass that along to customers in a lot of cases. So having the ability to sort of shape your load during the day. Renewables are great, but only during certain times of the day. Depending on the weather, they may not produce as much as you expect. So the grid has gotten very volatile. You see that particularly in places like California and Texas. But the more technologies introduced for things like EVs, the more renewables there are that are really not guaranteed what the output's going to be at any given point in time. Organizations are whether it's a commercial building, whether it's a multifamily property, you want to have some resilience against things like that. So there are a lot of energy investments that should be looked at. They're not all necessarily OPEX related up front. Some of those are going to be CapEx, but they could have OPEX implications down the road.
Yeah, over the long term.
And we've tried to be flexible with our solution. I'd say the vast majority of what we do is CapEx. It's a hardware plus a one-time data subscription for the life of the device. But we also have OPEX version of it, hardware as a service, basically, because we've encountered that, where it's like, hey, that's a barrier for me to get this deployed. I need to work this into my OPEX budget. I'm not going to fit this in on a CapEx. So.
Yeah, makes sense. Other thoughts from other panelists on this?
I was just curious, your thoughts on all of the ecosystems and like rule settings, scene settings, like controlling your appliances and lighting, and like how big of an impact is that actually having on OPEX savings?
Thermostats absolutely do. I think that's the number one spot. We touched on this a little bit in the first panel I was on Monday, but there are incentives for the owner operator and for the tenants to cooperate on shaving load during those peak demand events. From a demand response perspective, that is something that there can be sort of a team effort, and the savings get passed along to both parties. So there's organizations we work with that in some cases use our technology. They work with the thermostats that are already in the buildings to help drive the savings to the customers and to the owners. I came out of the smart home space. Actually, my last role was at a managing a smart home portfolio, and I think the reality is, from an energy perspective, the thermostats are driving the most value right now. If you have just regular LED bulbs in a building, whether they're smart or dumb doesn't necessarily change the energy profile of them that significantly. It's more about the amenity, and there is an amenity component to it for sure. But the energy savings, I think, really simple version of I think locks are an essential. I think thermostats are essential, and then some of the other ones, depending on the tenant, start to get into more of the amenity category. So,
I have a question. So then the smart energy, this is to kind of bill back to the tenants, right? Whatever kind of usage they do. What happens if the property is utilizing a RUB system or all bills paid? Then would we need the smart energy system?
yeah, I think different buildings have different reasons. One of the portfolios I'm working with right now, we're actually using this from a shadow metering perspective. Their challenge isn't billing the tenant. The tenants are all getting billed directly by the utility. Their issue is, and it's actually BC portfolios specifically, they need to report accurately for their investment funds what the ESG profiles for the portfolios are. And they only get the common space from the utility or a vacant unit. A vacant unit's not reflective of what an occupied unit is. So they have this, really challenging situation where the utility won't share the information. They're not going to be able to wrangle up bills from 200 tenants voluntarily. And so they're trying to figure out, how to
see the whole footprint.
Yeah. And so we're actually, depending on the use case, we may not even need to go to each individual unit. There's every block of units has a feed from the utility, and I can just monitor at that centralized point and pick up, 10 units, 20 units, whatever's in that footprint. So, we're doing that actually. It's called shadow metering, but it's another use of our technology to solve a very different challenge.
Gotcha.
So, yeah.
To provide information to.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
A whole other wrinkle, again, looking 5-10 years into the future, again, depending upon geography in the United States, is a large push for decarbonization, where you're going to see a lot of appliances within the home that have traditionally been natural gas that are moving to electrical, and so you're going to see
Water
greater
heaters,
load.
all that, yeah.
Yeah, you've got some areas right now on the West Coast where by regulation, in the next 6 months, new builds can't have natural gas water heater. They have to be electric pump, and you're going to see more of that moving into HVAC. And so understanding how to balance that when you potentially can have more electricity usage than you've had in the past, although more efficient appliances than we've seen historically. But if you can balance that in with solar and batteries, you can still reduce either OPEX to yourself or OPEX to your residents.
Yeah, I think ultimately you want to reduce the OPEX. Underlying that though is aligning the incentives between you and your tenant. So, if your tenants don't see any downside to leaving their unit at 68 degrees all summer, they're not going to be incentivized to help you reduce the usage, and ultimately that benefits all the tenants when they're aligned on that. So.
And having systems that communicate with each other that can see I can see the doors locked.
Yeah, I was going to say, even from a CRM perspective, ultimately, the goal should be to having a single view of the customer, of your customer is your tenant. You should have a single view of that. And so whether that's what have the maintenance needs been there, how long have they stayed here, what amenities have they opted in for, whether it's ADT or one of the other providers, it's like what packages do they have that through our network of options that we give them. I think having that visibility to that, you want to centralize that in as many places as you can. Ultimately, that gets to hey, I'm gonna even how much you billed for your EV every month. Being able to have that type of visibility in the single view is important.
But knowing that the door is locked, that is a potential indication that the resident is not home. Maybe not the only one, because they could be home and just locked it behind them. But then having a motion sensor within to say, okay, now I'm not seeing any movement inside, to combining with either an app or Bluetooth on the phone and saying, I'm not seeing the phone normally connected to certain things. Yeah, I don't think anyone's home. turn down the
I think,
thermostat.
yeah, my perspective, you always have to think of the customer and what they're looking for. So for me, there's a subset of tenants who may have privacy concerns and not want to have, but if it's an opt-in, it's like, hey, we can work with you to reduce your energy bill
Right.
by opting into X, Y, and Z. When you're not home, we'll optimize the unit for you, so it'll be ready for you when you come back, but it's not going to be wasting energy when you're away. That benefits everyone, but that has to be sort of that proactive opt-in, I think, in a lot of cases.
Yeah, those can be personalized also, right?
Yep.
So it knows who's walking in that door, and it sets the thermostat to a certain temperature. The lights in certain areas come on, right? So you can really customize your utility usage.